Welcome, Austin, Alan, Jim. We're here talking about the wargaming history of Jim Dunnigan and SPI and strategy and tactics and the like. One of the things that you did, Jim, very early on was you had a playtesting night that I don't know when you guys named it the Friday Night Follies, but could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, it began. I think it was after I'd started designing for Avalon Hill.
Mm-hmm.
I did 2 games for them early on. Jutland in 1914. I think that was 67 and 68. They were published, and I was also working on my own designs. They became the test series games. They were published twice. Once as test series games, and then we cleaned them up a bit later on. We published most of them as SPI games. And I needed playtesters. And Al and I got in touch. I think it was through the general. They would, I think we both wrote letters to the general, and they always have the city, the town, whatever, not the actual, street address. And I think the general did that because in those days it was hard to get in touch with other gamers. And it was obvious that, it was difficult to find opponents because even though Avalon Hill was selling, more games than SPI, they were, in fact, until, I guess, 74, 75, they sold more games than anybody else. But after 76, we surpassed them. But most importantly, we had a more open editorial attitude in S&T and Moves magazine, the gaming magazine, which made it easier for people to get in touch with one another. And we encouraged that because it basically meant more playtesters, which many smaller gaming companies that sprang up during the 70s, like Game Designers Workshop and what have you, they didn't have this. They weren't in a large urban area because on Friday nights at SPI, we'd have anywhere from 2 dozen to 30 or 40. Sometimes it was really crowded. But anyway, it all started with Al down in Brooklyn, and we had like a core group of maybe half a dozen guys. There was Eddie Brisson, there was Pete McDonald, there was Champer, Doctor, as we call him now. He's an MD as well as a doctorate in something else. He was going through his hippie phase at that point. But he was smart. He was always smart as a whip. In fact, he was so good at playing the games, we call the finishing stages of balancing a game champerizing it. In other words, we'd say, all right, Bob Champer, says, go in there and do your worst, which was asking for it. And he would often not find a way to, basically break the game, a perfect, solution as we're gaming the game. But when he did, and he did in several times, we had to haul back and say, all right, let's analyze this. And he'd be involved in that. And we'd make him, change here, change there, and bing, and then it was ready for publication. But it all started with the happy half dozen, as it were, down in Brooklyn. And then in 68, I moved to Manhattan. And that was all those big royalties checks from Avalon Hill. Actually, those amounted to up till 68, I guess, in current dollars, over 10 grand. So in those days, money went a lot further, even not accounting for inflation. And I moved up to the Lower East Side, and I was going to Columbia at the time. I started there, and I think whenever the GI Bill was reinstated, I immediately transferred up to Columbia. And I had pretty good grades, and geez, I took a semester worth of credits that I gained in the Army. They had a college course program run by the University of Maryland, where they taught economics, math, history, you name it. And if you were in a post that had a place and your schedule was flexible enough, you could make it 3 or 4 times a week for the classes, and then take the test. You could pile up points, which in most cases, it was a legit operation. Even Columbia accepted it. So I get that to me, certifies the Army program. But anyway, when we started SPI in 69, we were still operating out of my place in initially in Lower East Side. But then we rented the first of many places. First was a basement off 2nd Avenue. the other tenants down there in the other spaces was a puppeteer and a pornographer, different people. But anyway, then we moved up to 23rd Street, and the rest is, history, as it were. Made several moves up there. But once we had a place, and that was the first place, was in the basement, which was pretty scary when the word got around and they'd come down. We attracted them first with pizza night, which was what we call playtesting, and we'd buy a couple of pizzas. But eventually, I got caught a couple of guys just coming down for the pizza. So we cut out the pizza, and at that point, they order in their own. Once you had them hooked, one freebie. It was like, drugs. And after that, we had a steady flow, the word of mouth, and what have you. Once it got up to the elite, high schools, like Dalton and what have you, that gave us a huge rush of pretty smart kids. We found out from the feedback that people became, mostly boys, became interested and capable of playing war games once they hit puberty. What the connection was, I don't know, but it was pretty much of a provable. It wasn't just a correlation. It turned out to be causation. You very rarely get anyone younger than that, coming in. But a lot of kids, the minute they discovered, those girls are ladies. They would, for a few years, be hopped up in games until they found out to get a little closer to the ladies, and then we lost them for a few years. We had guys coming back, after 3 or 4 year, skirt chasing hiatus, coming back semi-regularly for playtesting. We even got married guys, once they got settled. And it was daddy's night to get away from the youngins, and come down there and spend a couple hours playing games. So we had a pretty, wide. By the early mid-'70s, we had a pretty wide assortment of playtesters. Al was, again, one of the first and basically one of the ringleaders, as it were, with other senior staff members of the playtesting. It was really somewhat organized because once we were on 23rd Street, it was wide open, and we had to do some filtering. We only had a couple of flakes that we had to toss out or just asked to leave. Some nights we had a lot of tours. I mean, literally, some playtester was bringing in his friends from out of town and yada, yada. And as long as they wandered around, didn't get in the way, it was no big deal. They'd lock up the art department. That's where the one computer we had at that early days, that was the typesetting computer, and a lot of other stuff you don't want messed with. But otherwise, we had all these playtesting rooms and offices, which, again, people could turn the key on and lock. But usually there was so much traffic running around, nobody was going to sneak in anywhere, ruffle, pilfer, whatever. So it was run on the honor system. In this case, it basically worked. But the basic rule was, the testing was supervised. I would wander around the various heads of Terry Hardy and then Brad Hessel, the heads of R&D. I was the head troublemaker. I was the CEO, I guess, yeah. And I eventually appointed somebody else as you're the head of R&D. I was still turning out a lot of games, but I wasn't responsible for the day-to-day supervision of the progress of the games. Redmond, he basically did all the formal organization, the rules and what have you, that the case system. And we hired an editor from a scientific book publisher, to help with that. And he ended up going down to Washington and enjoying a long career working for the Beltway Bandits game development operations. Mark Herman was one of the big guys down in Washington. He was a vice president of one of the Booz Allen, I think, for years. So, there was a lot of churn, as it were. People came and went. Some we hired, others just, came and went. For example, one of our gamers took the Foreign Service officer's test and became, a member of the Foreign Service. And he was one of the guys that was captured in '79 in Iran, in Tehran, Rich Queen. He was the guy who was let out early because he had, what did he have? That I forget. It was the neuromuscular disease, which I think eventually killed him. But when he got out, he wasn't that sick. But the Iranians diagnosed him. They says, "Well, we don't want this cripple around here. He's too much trouble." Yada yada. We sent war games, for example, which they let in to help them pass the time, and they did. And they sort of mystified the Iranians, who guards were mostly university students who are fairly educated people. A lot of them spoke English. I don't know how many war gamers we created in Iran, but that was another offshoot, as it were, of our playtesting system. But it was an essential part of it. And when we wrote that book, War Game Design, which I think was published in 77 or 78, and we had a chapter in there. And then when I did the War Games Handbook in 1980, I devoted more and more space, to the details of recruiting and managing playtesters and playtesting. And that basically became the Bible, as it were, for all the other companies. I also picked up on using what we call blind testers, where at the end stages, we get people that we knew and trusted, et cetera, and make up one of the prototypes, handmade, as it were, and mail it off to them. They'd often have a group of local gamers, and their input was often very useful because they were blind. They weren't involved in playtesting at the early stages. They were getting sort of like the last pass, as it were. And we had to communicate by phone, or sometimes if they had a lot of comments and what have you, they'd write them or type them up and send them in. Got to remember, this is all in the pre-internet days. It was different back then. But eventually, of course, now all those there's over a dozen small game companies which are still breaking even, at least, and making a little money. Yep. Almost all of them use mostly distant testers. They and it's easier, of course, these days to you got the desktop publishing, what have you, and there's more printing facilities. You can print out your prototype games and what have you, and mail them off to your testing groups. And they can email back, their critiques and what have you. But it all started back in the pre-internet days, where we were doing things by hand, and it worked out pretty well. Avalon Hill was similar, but they in Baltimore, they basically were drawing upon the local universities, colleges, and high schools. But was it Dave Pinsky? Pinsky, I forget his first name. And the other
Pinsky,
Larry Pinsky, and his sidekick, another name I forget, begins with H, or Buell or something like that. They actually designed a couple of games early on, but they also did a lot of the play testing, and they the ones who recruited play testers down there. Avalon Hill was basically operating out of, I think, 2 offices, and they were basically an annex to the warehouse, the printer's warehouse. So they had space, but they couldn't leave stuff set up because there was work going on, during the day, as it were. But they got their play testing done, and they put out some fairly complex games later in the 70s when they hired more staff, as it were. Don Greenwood and what was his name? The other guy that I didn't recommend, that I didn't know him. And Avalon Hill really got their mojo going, by the late 70s. But again, they used the same techniques. But again, those techniques have proliferated. But really, the mother of all Friday Night Follies, I don't think anybody else ever held open wargaming that attracted such a large and fairly regular group of people. And we had the whole gamut, from from high school and college students all the way up to Wall Street lawyers, stockbrokers, you name it. And then on top of that, if that wasn't enough feedback, as it were, we held several focus groups where we picked names at random, so to speak, out of local. We had the big printout of all of our subscribers, and we'd send them a letter offering on a certain date to come on down for an hour or two for a focus group. We get a free nosh, they get a free game, and they get to give their comments, face to face. And one of the most interesting things I got out of that was one reason a lot of people, and this came from a doctor who came on down, He said he didn't really have much time. He was a fairly young doctor, so they're busy as hell when they're getting started. He says, I don't really have enough time to play them, but why I buy so many is because I can read them, and we've popped that into the feedback questions. That was when that happened, and we found out there was maybe 10-20% who didn't really buy them so much for playing, but they could look at the map, they could look at the counter sheet, they could scan through the rules, and this is what a lot of veteran gamers were doing, especially R&D people. You could look at a game and suss it out pretty quickly without ever breaking, setting up the map and the counters and whatnot and playing it. And you got pretty accurate at that. I mean, I acquired that skill early on. That's why I was such a prolific designer, because I wasn't really interested in playing them that much, except during the early, developing the prototype, because I could basically look at a situation. Al was another one who could do that. I mean, he was very useful because he had a wider brief of he remembered sources better than I did. We also bought a stack pass to Columbia, and of course we had the 42nd Street, the main library, the New York City library. But that stack pass up at Columbia was invaluable because I had one of those when I was a student. My last 2 years at Columbia, I was on an honors seminar, whatever, like an MA thesis without the MA. And that one bonus that got you was a stack pass, and I could just jump down there in the stacks, and boy, it was paradise. But anyway, we had no shortage of people who were willing to grab the stack pass and take the subway up to Columbia to spend a few hours down in the stacks, looking for stuff. You couldn't check anything out, but you could take notes and what have you. And if you spoke some languages, at that point I read pretty good French and German. And I'll never forget, the gold mine of stuff I found down there. The only shortcoming was the damn Germans during the 30s, and that's when they published their World War I official history. They used this what they call Fraktur, and that's like an old timey, typeface, which I think even a lot of Germans had trouble reading it. But I had to, basically plow through it. But that was a gold mine, because these were documents that you wouldn't find in bookstores, you wouldn't find in most libraries. There was a lot of stuff that wasn't even in the 42nd Street Library. Another problem with the 42nd Street Library, as years went by, you couldn't check stuff out of there, but didn't stop people from stealing. And we found a lot of valuable sources just were no longer available. Some after-action reports, some books with nice order of battle stuff, intelligence, books people wrote after small print run books that didn't have a large circulation, but the libraries grabbed them, and some criminal collectors grabbed them out of the 42nd Street Library.
One of the other problems the library had was some of those books were so huge. Like remember the Third Army?
The after-action reports, the Third Army, yeah.
So what the library eventually discovered, this is like years later when they hired a team to clean the shelves. Imagine, at 50 years of dust.
Right. Yeah.
So the team went in there and they began discovering books in all sorts of weird places.
Yes, that's where a lot of the books probably disappeared. They were misshelved.
Yeah, the clerk would say, I ain't going to take this MF and 3-volume, 200-pound book, down to the umpteenth cellar. I'm going to put it here with the children's literature,
Right. Nobody will ever find it. But anyway, at least we became aware that those books existed. And when I started working down at in the 70s, I was going down and lecturing down at the Army War College, and also secondarily in Washington and what have you. I'd mentioned those titles, and they often had copies, like the Strategic Bombing Survey. I always was, and I still am, feuding with the Navy, the Air Force, for not paying attention to their own lessons. Mm-hmm. And of course, the biggest problem was BDA, Battle Damage Assessment, which through, I think, 4 wars, they've underplayed, didn't pay enough attention to. And then when the dust is settled and they get a chance to put people on the ground, it says, gee, why didn't we catch this? Well, you weren't paying enough attention. I don't know if I finally got through to them. I do follow that strategy page. I'm always looking out for new information on that, but it's a black hole in the Air Force to this day. When I was going down to the Air Force War College for a few years on a regular basis to talk, I found out that I get blank looks. Oh yeah, we send in reconnaissance aircraft. Let me take pictures, but then I started reeling off the stories, and I said, "Go look at the strategic bombing survey." And one of the things I used the strategic bombing survey was for the Flying Fortress game. That was a strategic bombing over Germany and France. And I found a lot of things in there. For example, we could have stopped the war early on if we hadn't misinterpreted in the initial analysis the target. They had a targeting committee. All sorts of experts. Some of them were real, some of them were alleged. But one thing they all missed, nobody picked up on the fact, and it was no big secret, it wasn't top secret, that the German electrical power distribution grid wasn't set up like the one in the United States. And actually the German grid was fairly typical of the ones in Europe. But anyway, it wasn't as interconnected. It didn't have this huge infrastructure that would allow you to shift large quantities of power from one area to another. We had it because we have natural disasters and what have you. But that's still something somewhat unique, to large countries, industrialized countries like the United States. But the Germans were extremely vulnerable. If you knocked out 2 or 3 power generation plants, they'd be in bad shape. And we only found out after the war was over. We interviewed people in German industry, and they basically confirmed. Well, that's why I got into the strategic bombing survey that was based upon these interviews. That as resourceful as the Germans were, they could repair damage, they could shift manufacturing plants, but they needed electrical energy. And the problem with those big power plants was they had certain components that had a year or more lead time. Maybe 10 months if you sped it up, but you just couldn't get spare parts off the shelf and put it all back together again. So that was their huge vulnerability. So to make the game work, I had to make hitting that random, very random. The power grid, because it had a very low priority during the war. But anyway, these are the things games teach you. You like I say, being able to look at a game. I guess it makes sense for doctors and lawyers to be people who read a game, because they're accustomed to looking at a patient or listening to a client and what have you, looking at a complicated situation and basically laying it out in a logical way in their heads. So they could basically follow it through, whether it be for surgery or diagnosis or winning a complicated legal case. It was the same kind of quality that was required for people to be interested in war games. In other words, there were a lot of people out there. Well, 2% of the population. Actually, that's probably fewer than the percentage who are lawyers. You needed people who had that skill, that perception analysis, as it were. As well as an interest in history. And as we later found out, as our gamers got married, had kids and what have you, needed time, which you ran out of as you got into the childbearing phase. Yeah. And that's probably why a lot of our most regular gamers were skewed young. They were past puberty, but they hadn't discovered how to score with the ladies yet.
Yeah. One of the things about the game testers was, the older ones we got, the married guys with kids who sometimes show up with their kids, because they were more mature, there was usually, not always, there was more valuable interaction, I think.
Yes. And also, I think we need feedback. And damn, that's a valuable resource. I wish I had kept records of the results. Oh, no, actually, we did publish the results. Well, anyway, anybody who's got those old copies of the magazines, you can flip through the outgoing mail where that's the editorial thing and in every issue where we gave the results. But we had it once we discovered that disparity in playing attitudes between the very young and the older gamers. We had to make that an aspect of game design. So you're constantly getting feedback, not just from the game, which is very important, and we go into that in war game design and anything else I've written, the War Games Handbook. that, once you get a playable prototype, it may not be 100% accurate, but it's able to feed back to you. You play, this isn't working. And I remember Al, I especially with naval matters, we were doing a lot of naval games. Well, not a lot, but more than anybody else was. And Al he was the naval expert. And he basically had sources, or he had stuff off the top of his head. But we'd often have to get maps and what have you and work out what actually happened. I mean, a lot of naval actions weren't as straightforward as, Savo Island. Or even some of the carrier battles. There were a lot of actions which were a bit more complex, and that's what made them gaming situations. But you had to work out all the details, as it were, who could actually do what, and it wasn't just a matter of looking at ships and, well, they got cruisers, we got cruisers, we got pretty good crews, they got pretty good crews. That's not. As I discovered in Jutland, just having the same number of ships, it all depends on the training and the mentality, as it were. Not so much of the crews. The crews can always, if you got good chief petty officers, everybody will look at their crews up to the same level of competence. But it's the Germans had an advantage in World War I, not a major one, but it was significant in the design of their ships. I don't know. I never found out exactly how they got that. I think they just listened more. And I looked at it with an analytical eye more so than the British. The British made too many assumptions. But their tactical officers, and you saw this in World War II with the submarine war, they basically stayed in the game, long past, when they should have gotten out. I mean, in terms of casualties, because I think in the end, the casualty rate among submarine crews was something like 80-90%.
Yes.
There were a few survivors.
Yeah, recent estimates now suggest, the traditional date for the critical moment in the victory in the submarine war is usually given as March 43, and some people studying submarine losses and crew losses and whatnot are basically saying that sometime in 42 probably was the critical moment. Once the Allies began to understand the problem, that was the critical thing. Stuff coming out of the shipyards made the difference beginning in 43. But the decisive moment was not 43, but 42 because of that.
Yeah, understanding how they use the wolf pack tactic.
Yeah.
And also the Germans, apparently they didn't do this out of suspicion of Ultra, our code breaking operation, which broke a lot of their codes. The problem with the military was it wasn't just one secret code. Even if they used the same machine, like the Enigma machine, which was the basic one they used, the unbreakable machine, that should teach you something about computer security. But anyway, each service and often both different groups in each service had their own code. And even if you broke the code in like the Army, that got you started with the Navy, but you were still not decoding enough information. And the submarines had their own code, and the submarines also had Enigma machines. That's why it was so important. The British captured one submarine. I think we might have captured one. But the important thing was we didn't just capture the submarine. We got somebody down below to grab the Enigma machine, because the Navy version of the Enigma was a little different from the one used by the other services. And
we got one of the very first commando raids, the one up there in Svalbard or wherever the heck, one of those frozen islands.
Yeah.
It turns out that although the raid had a legitimate object above board, destroying the fish oil production facilities and whatnot, it turned out the British had discovered that there was an Enigma machine up there, and they did grab the machine, but then they sort of left it on the shelf for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, it was the Poles who pioneered breaking the Enigma. And in fact, when Poles who got out of Poland and it finally over to Britain, well, they first sent their information they were getting. So the Brits knew about, the Polish code breaking activities. And at the same time, we were doing it to the Japanese. They weren't using Enigma, and we cracked. That was the magic, codes that made the Midway victory possible. But the Poles got themselves an early version of the Enigma, and that got to Britain. But again, as Al pointed out, they didn't quite take it. They realized how seriously valuable capturing Enigma machines was. But by 43, I think, was when they captured the first one in a submarine. Again, I don't have the exact date. But that was a gold mine because they had never seen the naval Enigma. They knew it was different, and it was much more difficult to crack. That's why as Al was pointing out, one of the big things they discovered with the Wolfpack tactics in 42, which by 41 and 42 were a major, reason why we were losing so many ships, was that we couldn't crack that code. Now we had the Huff-Duff, the directional finding and what have you, but the Germans were out wise to that. And they basically used very few radio communications. They were very brief, maybe a few seconds, as it were, at certain times. And the subs spent most of their time on the surface, so they could afford to be around or have their antenna up to catch the burst signals, as it were. But they had like a playbook where you got certain brief codes that couldn't give away your location, with the Huff-Duff, the what do you call it, the few submarines that were broadcasting longer messages. They basically neutralized the effectiveness of that. But once we got the naval Enigma sorted out, that's why people mention, 43. We were starting to read the naval Enigma. But of course, the big thing that happened in 43 was we realized we could send out these jeep carriers, the small aircraft carriers that carried maybe a dozen, aircraft. And that gave them air cover in the gap. There was this black hole, as it were, in the center of the North Atlantic where there was no air support. In the rest of the Atlantic, you had these naval maritime patrol aircraft. Many of them were just bombers, converted to carry depth charges and more fuel and what have you. But they could only go so far, so you had this gap of 1,000 kilometers, wide, and that was the death zone. You had to go through it. It wasn't worthwhile trying to go around it because either way it'd take too long, et cetera, et cetera. But once we had the jeep carriers in with the large convoys, the Germans were screwed. Because these carried radar, so even at night you could spot the Wolfpack assembly.
This is a nice segue into what I want to talk about next, which is the creation of solo games or purpose-designed solitaire games. One of yours was Wolfpack, but the first one that SPI did, or it was in Strategy and Tactics, was Fall of Rome, which was done by John Young.
Yeah.
When did the concept of saying, hey, maybe we could do solo games, was that based on some of the feedback that you were getting that, most players played solo when they actually had the copy of Strategy and Tactics, or they bought a box version of one of the SPI games?
There were two reasons. One was that we knew a lot of people, large, I think half, played solitaire. But a lot of them, again, we got this out of the focus groups, they did that by preference. They basically just turn the map around or get on the other side of the table. That's how people hone their chess game, as it were. But people enjoyed, unlike chess, which is kind of dry or more of a purely intellectual exercise. You learn more playing both sides of the game. In fact, that was that, and the other element for that was there were some situations where it was really a solitaire game. I mean, the other side was so programmed in what they had to do. They had restrictions and what have you, that the situation was best done as a solitaire game. For example, the Germans had a problem. They didn't have the kind of communications capability that the surface forces had. They were basically submersible gunboats. They carried torpedoes. They were slow, and stealth was their primary defensive, asset. So when a wolfpack would basically operate almost autonomously. It would detect the presence of an approaching. They have scout submarines, and offshore, as it were, there just to spot a major convoy moving out. the guy would send out a brief message, again using this code so the Huff Duff wouldn't locate him too quickly, and he'd go down and basically evade. But after that, it was pretty much automatic. Available submarines would automatically form, and they knew this. The captains had their playbooks, as it were, and they had various ways of approach: head-on, flanking, yada yada. Germans had they did a lot of research on this, and we only figured it out when we got one of the early operations research coups. Was again. Making operations research is what really turned anti-submarine warfare into a solo game, because the Germans, and partially this was they were Germans, very organized and what have you, but they basically were trapped by their own. Well, actually, initially they benefited from their own not rigidness, but always reacting with the plan. The wolf pack formation and tactics. There are very few decisions to be made, and some of them could be made with the roll of a die, so to speak. I mean, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. And this made solitaire games possible. So we did wolf pack, which was something of a let's throw this out there and see what happens. It's very popular. I still hear from people in the anti-submarine community over the years about they got a hold of a copy of Wolfpack and said, "Oh, this is great." And now it basically scraped up all the the data, and there was a lot available eventually by that 70s. A lot of it was classified for years on the tactics. And that was just an ideal game to turn into a solitaire. Fall of Rome was another great concept, because the barbarians were basically, they weren't under unified control. They were just doing what wandering barbarian tribes did, and that was closing in on the goodies, and that was the Roman Empire. And the only problem with that game is the rules got out, in a terrible state. I mean, that was such a disaster that we really tightened up. I mean, Redmond was steaming. He was our basically, how should I put it?
Perfectionist.
He was the biggest fanatic and the loudest, critic. If rules got out, they were screwed. In fact, I got into the habit, whenever a new game came out, I would take one home and actually sit down and play a couple of turns. And I would sometimes come in the next day ready to fire somebody. That's why one reason I took up running. I was always a little mellowed out after running 5 or 10 miles. And I would say, how did this get through? I wasn't just, reaming somebody up. I would say, a lot of times it was just, too many people dropped the ball along the way. And Redmond liked that. And he was doing the same thing, as a matter of fact. I think I might have learned it from him. But between the two of us, and a lot of other people started doing that, people who were not involved in a particular game, they grab a copy. We get them, a week or so before they were shipped. It was too late to change anything, although I think in a few, it might have been a rare cases, we have a piece of paper slipped in at the last minute at some expense, rules corrections. But the point was that, games were never finished. But there was, and that was an adage, I threw back at the developers and designers, says, I know you could do more, but at some time, if we're going to keep this, solvent, this operation, you got to have a cutoff date, do the best you can, at least get the rules straight. All right, Redmond will take care of all the art and stuff like that, and we'll ship it. And, es steht there, it stands there, as the German said. People will admire the fact that you got the damn thing out the door. And we were turning out, better quality, larger numbers of better quality games than Avalon Hill was. Their rules had some howlers. But again, they didn't have a bigger staff. They had no staff at all. So it's admirable how much they did, with so few people. But they learned from us, because they couldn't do the more complicated games they did later on, without, a staff, as it were, people who that's why when Tom Shaw came to me when he said he was going to staff up with some professionals, because up to that point, everybody was ad hoc, what do you call that? Students, playtesters on earning minimum wage, for doing some game design and stuff like that. I was familiar with Don Greenwood. He was publishing one of the zines, but he was a very active gamer, in the in the small print community as well. And I think he'd come down. He was up in Connecticut or somewhere up in New England, and he'd come down a couple of times, and I got to talk with him. And I said, I can highly recommend, Don Greenwood. He's a very knowledgeable guy, and he's probably available. And he was, and he went there. He was there for years, but he was the core, as it were. Of their professional design staff. But the problem was you had to make the game as tight in terms of the rules as possible. There may still be flaws in there. There always were. But people really get hacked off if they can't understand the rules, or, they basically do and they don't make any sense. A lot of the testing, a lot of the testing of the rules themselves had to do with what doesn't make sense, what is vague, what is difficult to interpret. That's one reason Redmond came up with the case system. You could add as many cases as you needed to basically clarify. There were exceptions and what have you. You had to keep that to a minimum. I was always a fanatic about having concise rules as possible. You don't need all this extra stuff. I got outvoted. I mean, there was these monster games, but even the monster games, they were physically large, but the rules didn't have to be so goddamn large. But some games, they were very complicated processes you had to go through, and this basically, in the glory days of the late 70s, there was enough people out there to buy these more expensive, more complex games. But long term, it was a bad bet because, again, you were selling to a lot of people who had less time, and that's why we had the game systems. We developed a game system the system I developed. I guess it was for France 1940. It was in the magazine that we used for 4 or 5 World War II operational level, division level games situations, and it worked very well. The quad games were all based upon, the same basic system. And that worked, a couple dozen games out of that. And the players appreciated that because they said if they were experienced gamer, they could basically sit down and learn a game, in 15 minutes. Just look at, we purposely put in, the exceptions and what have you. And bingo, they were off to the races. And that's where computers hurt us because the computers had the you just switch it on and what have you. And of course, the early computer game designers thought that they could have their online rules and whatnot. And I pointed out to some of them early on. Well, I realized it early on. You had to make the games intuitive. People did not want to read instructions. Mm-hmm. And Dan's in the software business. He's familiar with that. Yeah, and we had that infamous sign on the wall posted on every playtest room, RTFR. And if people ask what that stood for, read the fucking rules. And that was especially important in playtest games because we had a computerized, a typesetting system early on before we got personal computers in 77, 78. A year or so earlier, we had the computerized, which is basically an early model PC that did typesetting, but it could also churn out an early copy. You could basically type in the rules early on, and you could easily make, changes, but you could literally print out one copy and then Xerox it and pass it on. And the gamers were impressed with that, to have copyright, SPI, developmental, for development of use, whatever mumbo jumbo, was a turn on in those days. But, they appreciated that. And it drove home the fact that, unless you or, you later wanted to get a game that you didn't get involved playtesting, that wasn't combed thoroughly enough to get out all the, the obvious flaws that, everybody was going to suffer. The other thing people, again, the advantage that manual games still have is that you can easily change the rules, which is how a lot of game players became game designers. And this was early on, even before SPI got started, or at the same time, there were Avalon Hill gamers who were basically changing the rules of Avalon Hill games to, do different stuff with them.
Right. And then there were and then they had their fanzines where they would publish those rules. And
right.
Well,
right.
even you guys at the very earliest did some publishing where there's the Blitzkrieg system that you did.
The Blitzkrieg module system.
Right.
Yeah, that was 1970 or 71.
Yeah.
Right. That was a direct, homage to that. We were taking a game that was out there, Blitzkrieg, which was a basically an anonymous game. There was no history in it, but we expanded that and we invented it in the game. And Avalon Hill didn't come after us. We tried to avoid any obvious, infringement, as it were. You couldn't patent a game. You could only basically trademark, not trademark, but copyright printed material. Visual or written and what have you. But that gave other companies, publishers, a lot of leeway, and we accepted that early on, and that's why we published a lot of it. And we mentioned not going mail. I says, I said, it's not plagiarizing. Use the French word, homage. It's more dignified in many ways.
Right.
It's
so there was a computer company later on. I think their name was SSI.
Yes. They homaged us to death.
Right. Yeah. Richard Berg. I had a conversation with him about how they looked at your maps and they copied them so precisely that even you guys would put puns on the map.
Right,
so things that didn't really exist, and they had copied even those.
Yeah, and that's when you can nail them with a copyright violation. Publishers often do that, especially in expensive technical books. They'll put in not so obvious flaws that are unique, to that particular book, things you wouldn't actually catch. And if somebody else, plagiarized it, you could point out to that. Salting, that's so-called salting the manuscript.
Yes, we did that. Remember, we did that in Pacific War Encyclopedia.
Oh, right, the Skull Island, yeah.
Skull Island. Literally nobody has ever commented about that.
Yeah.
Dan, I want to say something that is not totally accurate, because that's the most unique rule in that Pacific War game. You would lose.
No, the encyclopedia.
The books we did.
The book.
I thought you were talking about the Skull Island rule. That was.
Oh, right. Yeah. In one of the games, we had the Skull Island rule where basically, the bad things happen if you landed on the island. Yeah. You know where I got that from? That actually is from a real incident. They had one of the naval battles was the Santa Cruz, I believe it was. And it was over who was going to get possession of Santa Cruz Island. And when they finally went onto the island, they didn't find King Kong or dinosaurs. They found a variant of malaria that was more fatal than any doctors had ever encountered. And they said it's not worth it to station any personnel. The natives are fairly, resistant to it, but that was developed over hundreds of generations, for God's sake. And so we basically backed off. And of course, the Japanese, they were out of the game as far as grabbing that island anyway. But if they'd gone in there, they would have died like flies. As it was in Guadalcanal, where you had your standard grade, South Pacific, malaria. That's where we basically, not taking your quinine pills, which was the thing that we would either resist malaria or at least mitigate the symptoms. It was a court-martial offense, and officers and NCOs were instructed to go around it personally because the stuff tasted like hell. But, a lot of guys saw somebody who didn't and got malaria, and they said, I think I'll take my pills on a regular basis. But when you get a strain of the stuff that's fatal like that, the pills are enough than enough. But in Guadalcanal, the Japanese didn't have the medical support that we had. And they found out, or I discovered this in studying that situation, that their battalions would waste away in a couple of months. I mean, literally, everybody would be, incapable of doing anything. Because of the everybody had this one case of one attack of malaria after another. The American battalions, again, where everybody was under strict orders, it was much slower. I mean, it was still there. People would still be carried off.
Initially, General. When the medical officers told General Van de Grief, we got to go out and kill these mosquitoes. He made some rude remark about how we're supposed to be killing Japs, not killing mosquitoes. But when the first cases of malaria began to happen, he quickly fell into line.
Yeah. And somebody mentioned to him the Japanese aren't killing mosquitoes, so the mosquitoes are our allies.
So
got to use them. It's like the Roman auxiliaries.
One of the things I'd like to wrap up with is talking a little bit about how SPI impacted things from the standpoint of, well, the future of wargaming as far as designers and like that goes, and then some of the other unique personalities that were there. I'll just rattle off the ones that I know on the design side that have continued to impact the industry. We'll put up the two that are probably the most well known, which are Mark Herman, who came in and was a playtester and then became a clerk and then became a developer and then a designer for you guys. You had Richard Berg, right? Mm-hmm. And he was there early on. Not early on, but came in in the mid 70s or so, right? Yeah. You had John Prados, I think is how you say his name.
He's still designing. Yeah,
he doesn't design so much now as he writes. He's a fairly prolific writer.
But he still gets involved in designing a few. I was going through the list of recent gaming publications, and I recognized a couple of names of guys who, like Mark and Richard, who passed away a couple of years ago.
Right.
Kept turning them out.
Mm. Yeah. And then you had Joe Balkowski. Is that how you say his name?
Yes.
Yeah, he got more into books than games. But he was an ace at both.
Right. He did a series for Avalon Hill that it has continued to be republished, and it's actually been other designers have gotten in with it and like that, but his base rule set is the same. Yeah. There's one where they took a system and Avalon Hill, basically continued to publish other versions of it. You have Eric Lee Smith. Who went on to, you had a bunch of guys that went on to go and develop that division of Avalon Hill, Victory Games.
Victory Games, yeah, that lasted for 7 or 8 years.
Right. And they're the actual ones that did some of the real pioneering work in solo games and have solo games that are still much coveted. Some of them. Now, did John Sutherland, did he do anything for you guys at S&T? Because he's one of the guys at Victory Games that did some games that go for hundreds of dollars now on the internet.
He might have been involved because basically Mark picked up. When SPI went out of existence, I think was it in '83 or something like that. That's when Mark started Victory Games, and he basically cherry picked, as it were. That's why Victory Games did so well until Mark got a job he offered, he couldn't refuse from the Pentagon, the contractors, and a lot of these people, because there were so many small game companies coming out, there was a time when the early desktop publishing came around, and again the system and later on the internet, but basically the knowledge, as it were, like London cab drivers, was pretty widespread. And there were guys who basically, if you were willing to give them, $1,000 or whatever, they would design a game for you, advance on royalties and what have you. And they found a way to make profitable games that would sell only a few thousand copies. These were companies that were basically, one or two people, maybe they had an office or maybe just a garage, one of them. And some of them are still in business. Again, if you're into creating the games, I mean, that's an ideal situation. You might have a lot of them have good jobs, day jobs, as it were. But this is their hobby. And early on, it was Schedule C. And so those who didn't know about it, I said, look, when you do your taxes, look at Schedule C. That's for a business activity, not a secondary one. And I says you can basically expense a lot of what you spend on designing and publishing games and all the books you buy and what have you. It's in effect, you're getting all that stuff for, 30, 40, whatever your tax bracket is, off. And to this day, I use that, although I don't buy any books anymore.
Right. I use that today. I've used that probably ever since I've known you.
Yeah.
So, one of the things too is there were some other people that rolled out. They may have been designers or they were play testers that moved up in the U.S. government and in the corporate world. You mentioned Mark ended up at Booz Allen, who he was over like their group that did stuff for the government as far as simulations and like that. But I want to mention one that has a special place in my heart because I met him and got to spend some time at an Origins. He's passed away. He designed Armada for you, Sterling Hart.
Yes.
Oh yes. Oh,
Yes.
Sterling was one of the guys who he was a Harvard graduate. He went to Harvard Business School. He was a very well educated guy. His wife was a professional software developer, Julie. Stayed in touch with her for years after he passed away in the 90s. But anyway, I'll never forget the day these guys in suits coming to the playtesting. Or just coming to visit to see if this place actually existed, and we had these wooden planks out in the underground layer, on 12th Street, our first office, as it were. And we basically talking about Dungeons and Dragons. We were at the end of the hall, and they had these wooden planks, as it were. But sometimes when it rained heavily, there'd be a little water down there on the floor. So he was coming down there, and he said, "This is SPI." And I says, "Yeah," and we introduced ourselves, and we were famous friends, right up until he passed away. In fact, when they were, after I left SPI, I kept getting offers to get back in, which I always turned down, especially in Washington. But at one point, they asked me if I'd basically put together the first wargaming center for the National Defense University down in D.C. And I said, "Look, guys, I got my hands full up here in New York, but I can recommend." And I recommend Sterling Hart and what's his name, our retired general. God, the name escapes me. Anyway, Sterling was then working for an advertising agency down in the D.C. area. I think it was what do you call it? One of the big auto insurance companies. And he was pretty high up in the hierarchy, but he always wanted to work for, wargaming and the government, and eventually he ended up with the CIA. That's where he was working when he died. And I said, well, what about Sterling Hart and Bill? I forget his name. But anyway, they interviewed them both, and they hired them both. Sterling was the guy in charge. He had more experience. And the other guy, he was a general in military police. That was the only police general in the American Army. But anyway, I met him. He was an instructor up at West Point. And he'd come down to the playtesting sessions a couple of times. That's where I met him. He was an enthusiastic gamer. And that did very well. In fact, Sterling ran that for several years until the CIA offered him a job. And that's where he was when he passed away. Right. He was happy as a, pig in shit, as it were.
Yeah.
But anyway, yes.
And that's what I met him was he was in the CIA and he brought a fellow spook with him that was also
right.
We had a Utah Mormon connection.
Yeah. You guys gave the secret handshake or whatever.
Right.
A lot of Mormons get into the Foreign Service because they learn languages because of their missionary duty early on, and they're more they tend to be more trustworthy than your average Gentile. But anyway, and
we didn't smoke. A lot of us didn't smoke a lot of pot, so that helped out.
Well, we kept that's true because you couldn't drink caffeine or alcohol. But anyway, there's still reserve intelligence units out there in Utah.
Yep.
Because there are so many intelligence specialists or people who speak foreign languages. Yeah, we had, as Al has found out, because a lot of them, when these guys discover me, once email became a big thing in about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I've been using it. I was online since '79 on CompuServe, I think it was. But anyway.
Yeah, and then you were on the Genie system and AOL early on.
Right. Yeah. These systems were basically very small. in terms of the number of people they had. But since our war gamers, we called it, or Howie Brash I think coined this term, the hobby for the overeducated. And they were basically, the early adopters of computers, you name it, any new tech or tech idea. And these guys, they would start looking around. I mean, my email address was in my books. That's where I put it. That's why I still have the AOL account. I check once a month or something like that, because that's sitting in a lot of my early editions of a lot of my books. And I said, hey, don't write, email, because it's easier to deal with. I started having a lot of these. And I always, when I'd reply, I'd CC Al. And Al would often remember them better than I would, because Al would basically be sitting down with a lot of these playtesters and talking shop. I'd be flitting around, dealing with business matters and, just checking a long list of games for that. Fridays is when I did my performance analysis and what have you. And one of the things we got every week was this big printout. It was, bound in a folder. We had time cards, but they were very simple. You simply filled in the percentage of your time you spent on each project, and there was no miscellaneous. So you had to basically bill, this is for the game development, part-timer and full-timer, you had to bill all your time to some project. And every week they knew Jim would look at this damn stuff. And occasionally I'd find, what's going on here? And they stopped doing whatever they were doing, which they weren't supposed to be doing. But anyway, I could often spot problems or simply areas that were getting more billables than I thought they should have. And most cases, it was for a good reason. There were some problems with the design, et cetera. Or maybe there were personnel problems. And so I'd be running around Friday night taking care of that. But Al wasn't burdened with those bad cop duties, and he got to talk more with the kids.
I was also keeping the dossiers. Remember,
right,
we had the little
right.
Because after every play test, we'd ask the designer or the developer, how did these testers go, and so we could rate them.
Yeah.
Because I can always remember the dribbler. There was a category called the dribbler. Yeah. We don't want these guys.
Probably the category I would have been in.
Well, the thing was that there were some guys who were pains in the butt, and not very helpful during the design of the game. But when we were getting towards the end of going to get ready to go to press, several of the developers would say, "Yeah, give me so and so, because he's such a nitpicker. We'll really find the bloopers."
Yeah.
Right.
And also, Al had to collect that information to decide who qualified to go in the credits, because your big thing was in the game credits, designer, developers, playtesters. And after a while, people learned that was a big deal, not just anybody who sat down and spent a couple hours playing it, but only those people who stuck with it and made a valuable contribution.
Yeah.
There you find a lot of future, people who were designers later on.
Right.
Now, go through those games.
Now, one of the things that was different about SPI and strategy and tactics was you would give credit to the designer, you give credit to the developer, and you would give credit to the playtesters, which wasn't something Avalon Hill did.
Well, no, Avalon Hill followed the game methodologies. And one of the things I did when they asked me to do, to sell them. The first two games I did, I had no leverage. Jutland in 1914. But when they asked for Panzer Blitz, which was one of their all-time bestsellers, right up there with Squad Leader, I said one of the stipulations is you will put on the box, designed by James F. Dunnigan, graphic design by Redmond Simons. And you will put that in the rules. And once that happened, there was no going back. The horse was out of the barn, and he wasn't going back. And they basically were forced to do that. Now, we already did that, with SPI games. That's where it came from. But that with once Avalon Hill, bent over, as it were, it became standard throughout the industry.
Right, and it's still a big deal for those playtesters that really put their effort into playtesting the game to get the credit for it, even though they don't get paid for it. They want that credit.
Well, they get a free game and what have you. And a lot of them, if they were good playtesters, we had part-timers who would put in 10, 20 hours a week, on after school and on. For example, we didn't have any full-time receptionists.
Right. I think that's what Mark Herman did for a while, right?
Right. No, I had to fill in a couple of times when there was nobody, everybody was busy. And I said, well, look, what I'm doing, I can just sit there and answer the phone and keep on doing what I'm doing. And a few people wandered in who knew me and said, what are you doing? I said, well, we're one man short on staff. And that, in the 70s, that was the way things went, as it were. But we had no secretaries either. So a lot of the part-timers, one of the qualifications was, can you type? Yeah, everybody had to be able to type. Mm-hmm. So any correspondence or anything like that, entering data. We had full-time people doing the order processing that involved, typing stuff into a computer. But for miscellaneous letters and correspondence and whatever, anybody who could type, got an advantage in getting a part-time job. So yeah, they had these part-time jobs, which in several cases turned into full-time jobs, for a year or so anyway.
So we've run out of time. Next time, what I'm hoping we can talk about is, one, we touched on it a little bit today, but the monster game. I'd like to know more about the whole process and what was involved there. The other thing that I want to talk about is your political games that you did, and some that you yourself don't list as a political game, but I want to throw into that category. One of the games I want to talk about next time is Chicago.
Okay.
And
up against the wall, too, maybe.
Right, and up against the wall. So we'll be talking about those next time.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right.